Well, welcome back. We're talking about China's Belt and Road Initiative as nearly 40 world leaders gather in Beijing for the second Belt and Road Forum. Let's get back to our panel right now. And let me start with you in Singapore. China and Singapore have created what's known as the Chongqing Connectivity Initiative to serve all countries in the region. What's that about?
Well, I think it's about actually linking the belt and the road. The belt being the Silk Road economic belt, it goes through the central part of Asia to Eastern Europe, and the road being the 21st century maritime Silk Road going through, for example, South China Sea and then to Indian Ocean and to Middle East and so on. So this is basically an initiative to sort of link these two, the belt and roads together via, for example, the city of Chongqing in China. So it involves both the road part as well as the belt part, and it was meant to be a very large logistic initiative, enabling goods to go from Southeast Asia to the central part of Asia as well as Eastern Europe very smoothly.
Philippe Monnier, Switzerland was the first country in continental Europe to sign a free trade agreement with China. So if we look at this Belt and Road Forum initiative right now, is Switzerland's involvement in the BRI a natural extension of that free trade agreement?
I would not say it is a natural extension. I would say it is something additional. I think both the FTA on this BRI, for Switzerland, there is some symbolism. And sometimes the MOU that Switzerland will sign in 2 or 3 days is a little bit vague, is a little bit general, but it helps a lot to have a better image of China in Switzerland, and maybe it helps to have Switzerland a little bit more visible in China in terms of business, and I think this is good. I know, for instance, some head of cities in Switzerland, they bought some Chinese trucks, and I asked them, you are not concerned because the brand is not very known? And they told me, no, I'm not really concerned because Switzerland has an FTA with China. So if the Swiss government has an FTA with China, it should be that China is a reliable supplier of trucks.
Yun-Sun, the United States, Canada, and the European Union, they've entered into an agreement to offer economies a better alternative, I guess, to models like the BRI, which they say is a state-led model. They want to connect private lenders with governments. What do you make of that? Is that a better system? Will it work? Is it complementary to the BRI?
We have heard a lot about this, that the U.S. somehow and its allies will come up with an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, supplementing or offering an alternative to what they call quality infrastructure projects. But I think there's a key issue here. First of all, for the private sectors of these countries to go to these less developed countries, they haven't been there before, or they have reservations about investing in these countries. So for the government to push them to go to the countries that the private companies are not willing to go, the government will have to throw in investment or initial startup capital for these companies to make such decision. Then that gets into the question of what is U.S. comparative advantage in this competition. We here in Washington, D.C., we do understand that the U.S. government strength is not with state-led investment plans. So, for example, the U.S. Exim Bank will make the effort to compete with the Chinese effort to promote U.S. private companies to go to these countries. But I think there's a limit to it. We also see that the U.S. government allocating funding in a couple of tens of billions of dollars in that direction. But still, to compete with the vast financial resources that the Chinese government can put on the table to push forward for the infrastructure development, the comparison or the competition is going to be extremely difficult for the United States.
Adam, Garrie, what do you make of these two systems? On the one hand, the BRI, and the other one being proposed by the US, Canada, and the EU?
Well, private lenders, no matter their size, are in it to make a short-term profit. Otherwise, they can't survive. Governments operate differently, and one only needs to turn to the United States to understand that. The U.S. has somewhere around 22 trillion in debt, much of it external. If that was a business, it wouldn't function. But because it's a government, it happens to be the strongest economy in the world. So I think it will be quite difficult for the private sector to take the long view that's necessary when trying to turn around developmental trends in nations that have unfortunately lagged behind for a long time. And again, I think this proposal from the EU, Canada, and the US is coming from a misguided direction. Belt and Road is all about international cooperation and connectivity with no strings attached, no political agenda, and certainly, I would say thankfully, no military agenda. So this idea that one needs to compete rather than cooperate actually goes against the spirit of win-win, which, if implemented by all countries, would be to the benefit of all countries. So I think that both systematically and in terms of the conceptuality, there's a bit of a shortcoming from these proposals.
I also know sometimes you get some countries where sentiment changes very quickly. If you look at Malaysia, in 2017, there were plans announced for a Chinese-financed cross-country railway line, part of the BRI initiative. Malaysia was fulsome in its praise of this initiative. But a year later, the Malaysian leader slammed that very project, saying it was corrupt, it was costly, and it would saddle the country with too much debt. What changed in Malaysia?
Well, I think that perception of the deal being having a corrupt element, I think is a very widespread one in Malaysia. I think the new regime, for example, is not so much blaming China as to sort of commiserate with China, being in essence a victim of the previous regimes trying to sort of get their hands at various state money in a very kleptocratic means, for example, by jacking up the price of such an infrastructure project and demanding kickbacks and so on. That, to the new Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir, is something not acceptable. So in a sense, he would like to right the wrong, and thereby he initiated the renegotiation with China such that the construction price is now slashed by about 1/3. So I think people like Dr. Mahathir, leaders like him, as well as a lot of Malaysians, we do need, for example, railroads and so on, but not at an elevated pricing structure. And what Dr. Mahathir did in sort of negotiating down the construction price, I think it's very well received in Malaysia.
Philippe Monnier, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini said during a recent visit to Beijing that the European Union would offer strong backing to the Belt and Road Initiative. But if you listen to some European companies, you hear different. Some companies operating in China have complained about market reform, about market access. So how does one reconcile these two views?
You know, I think that we have to look industry by industry. On some industry are closer than others. I think it's a very broad debate about how open the Chinese market is. I think there are different opinions I think it's a little bit a new debate. I have maybe a comment about the previous point, about the debt trap. What I find good about the Belt and Road Initiative is that it is an invitation. It's an offer, and it's good to have an offer. And every country is free to accept or not this offer, or they can negotiate, or they can only accept part of it and for their best interest. Or maybe they can say, yes, I want to be part of it, I want to be linked, but I will finance it myself, or finance it partly myself. So I find the Belt and Road Initiative quite a good initiative because it is an invitation. It's not an obligation. It has nothing to do with colonialism.
Sun Yun, I have one final question. I mean, we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, we talk about trade, investment, infrastructure development, etc. But if we look at another benefit here, tourists made around 60 million trips between China and other BRI partner countries in 2017. So how important has this initiative been for people-to-people exchanges?
That's part of the BRI initiative, right? So the connectivity between people and people, between countries and countries, that's one of the initial agenda when BRI was first proposed. So this increasing of tourism between China and BRI countries was planned from the very beginning. And in many countries, for example, Southeast Asian countries, especially mainland Southeast Asian countries, that in the past did not have a very large number of the Chinese tourists, and now they are benefiting from the Chinese tourists coming to their country. Of course, associated with that, there are also complaints about the behaviors of Chinese tourists. But that's nothing new, and I don't think that's something that BRI can address in the short term. So I would say that from the people-to-people perspective, one, tourism does have the economic benefit for the recipient countries. Two, the hope from Chinese government is that this type of people-to-people exchange will help bringing an enhanced level of understanding between the Chinese people and the BRI countries. So in a different direction, it is hoped to consolidate the friendship and the understanding between China and the recipient countries. As for it works out in the end, we will see.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.